After being reincarnated, I woke up on the day when I was in my sophomore year of college. I used my family's resources to transfer Simon to the best hospital for an internship and let him receive a top-notch education. However, he hated me for violating his self-esteem and opposed me at every turn. Later, we were in a car accident. I became paralyzed from head to toe while trying to protect him. Just as my consciousness was fading away, he actually told me that the car accident was man-made. When I opened my eyes again, I was reincarnated on the day when his mother knelt down and begged my family to sponsor his schooling. Simon looked disgusted. I don't care about his family's money at all. Great. You really have backbone. I clapped my hands in applause. I really wanted to see what kind of future that hooligan Simon could have without an internship in a top hospital. I was reincarnated on the day when Simon's mother knelt down and begged my family to sponsor his schooling. The pain of being burned by fire seemed to still be gnawing at my heart, and in the next second, I was pulled back to reality by Simon's loud shout. "Mom, are you crazy? You're actually begging him. He's the murderer who killed Dad." I saw Simon's frenzied expression and trembled with fright. The disgust in his eyes was so obvious. Why didn't I notice it in my previous life? Simon's father died in an accident while trying to save my father. To repay them, my family not only gave a large amount of compensation but also took the initiative to sponsor Simon's schooling. Originally, my father was worried that Simon would become pampered in the elite school and didn't plan to let him transfer. But he couldn't resist my persistent begging. After the transfer, I not only cared about his daily life but also took time out every day to tutor him in his studies. With my meticulous help, his grades soared to the top 10 in his grade. However, he hated me for hurting his self-esteem. He not only spread rumors about me in school but also deliberately got closer and closer to a poor student in the class. After I told his mother about this, his mother threatened to cut off the mother-son relationship. She forced him to break off contact with that girl and to spend one day a week at my home to review his lessons. I got more opportunities to get in touch with him as I wished, but he said, "If it weren't for your family's little stinking money, I would think it was dirty even to look at you." After graduating from university, he became one of the top surgeons in the country and no longer needed anyone's sponsorship. I took the initiative to ask my parents to visit his family and facilitated my marriage with him. After marriage, my mother fell ill, and Simon was the chief surgeon. I thought it would be foolproof, but I never expected that it would cost my mother's life. At that time, I wondered how such a simple operation could go wrong. Now I finally realized that Simon had tampered with it. He hated me and, by extension, my whole family. Later, we were in a car accident while traveling. I protected him immediately, but I ended up being paralyzed all over. But in return, even though I had bed sores all over my back, he refused to hire a nanny for me. Even worse, when our daughter was not at home, he deliberately loosened the gas valve at home. When the house was engulfed in a raging fire, he stood outside, laughing wildly as if he were crazy. Does it hurt? That's the kind of life worse than death I lived in the elite school. If it weren't for you, how could I have ended up like this? Ha ha ha, you're so stupid. You didn't even know that I arranged the car accident and you still protected me. When I was on the verge of death, he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Eleanor, don't pretend to be charitable to me in the next life." I didn't understand. I had helped him so much. Why did I end up with such a result? I wanted to question him, but the thick smoke choked me so that I couldn't say a word. The fire devoured my flesh and blood inch by inch. I tightly grasped the bed sheet and looked at the ceiling in despair. Isn't it just a few days until a year has passed? Don't you care about Grandma's medical expenses? There's no need to be in such a hurry to get divorced. Nonsense. Without your father, Eleanor, do you think you could really have grown up to this age just by relying on me all these years? Simon's mother was furious. "Mom, you still haven't seen clearly that his family didn't treat us as human beings at all. Why are you still begging them? What's so good about the elite school? Is studying that important? I can drop out of school and work to support you." Looking at his crazy appearance, I just felt a chill in my heart. It turned out that all the cultivation and painstaking efforts my parents had made for him in the past were worthless to him. Before Simon could finish his words, a crisp slap landed on his face. He covered his face and looked at his mother in disbelief, only gritting his teeth and saying, "I don't care about his family's sponsorship at all. Really have backbone. In that case, I won't transfer schools either." I stood aside and clapped my hands in applause. Simon was stunned at first, looked at me in surprise, and then put on his usual disgusted expression on his face again. I curled my lips at him. Anyway, for me, I could do well in exams no matter which school I was in. In my previous life, if Simon's mother hadn't come to me and said that Simon could only have a future if he went to the elite school to receive a top-notch education, I wouldn't have bothered to transfer schools. This time, it was Simon's mother who was in a hurry. Simon was a famous school bully in the second middle school. In my previous life, I went to the bar many times to persuade him to study hard, but he humiliated me in front of his friends. This time, I no longer had any illusions about him. Simon's mother cried and made a scene in my family, but it still couldn't change the reality that Simon couldn't transfer schools. After returning to school, since I had learned the knowledge of Senior 2 before, my grades steadily improved, and I also took a lot of after-school time to engage in art. I shone brightly at the welcome party and became the number one on the latest school beauty list. While I was working hard to improve myself, Simon got together with Carol, who was the second on the school beauty list. Every day, he either skipped classes or smoked and fought. My father went to the school to persuade him many times. When he was pushed too hard, he would even shout abuse and say that my father was a deliberate murderer. I heard that the hooligans sponsored by your family beat up the son of the director of the Education Bureau to stand up for Carol. This incident has caused a stir in the school. It's almost certain that he'll be expelled. My best friend was telling me about the absurd things Simon had done when I ran into him head-on. I originally wanted to ignore him as before, but unexpectedly, he blocked my way and wouldn't let me go. He smiled frivolously, stepped on the cigarette butt under his feet, and touched his hair, thinking he was so handsome. My best friend saw the situation and immediately made an excuse and quickly left the scene. Before leaving, she also made a gesture of wanting to vomit. I said coldly, "Please get out of the way. Eleanor, the trick of playing hard to get won't work on me." I was just about to laugh when he added, "I didn't like you in the previous life, and I won't like you in this life either." Suddenly, a chill ran through my whole body. Simon was reincarnated too. The game seemed to be getting more interesting. However, if you help me sort out this mess, I don't mind being your boyfriend for a month. Only then did I realize that he wanted me to clean up the mess for him. In the previous life, I was always the one who cleaned up after him every time he made a mistake. He would say, "Eleanor, you're just like a dog that can't be shaken off no matter how hard I try." In the past, I was so blind in judging people that I ended up in a bad way. Did he really think that I would be as stupid as before now that I had a second chance at life? I sneered. "Simon, are you crazy? I was blind in the previous life to be so determined to marry you. In this life, I'd rather marry a dog than like you. Why didn't you think about the consequences before you hit someone? You want me to handle such a trifle for you? Where's your backbone?" Simon only knew to resent my family for making him transfer to the elite school, which made him live and study in a circle where he didn't fit in. But he never mentioned how many times my family had helped him since he was a child. Since we're both reincarnated, let's see who will have a better life in this life. Seeing that I had no intention of helping him, Simon turned around and left. Before leaving, he left me a sentence, "Don't regret your decision today." What a joke. I would really regret it if I helped him. When I walked into the classroom, my best friend ran over and said that the head teacher asked me to go to the office. It turned out that Simon's explanation to the school was that he mistook that the other person was mocking me for being the number one on the school beauty list, so he started the fight. Simon didn't know his own strength and directly broke 3 ribs of the other person. What's more serious was that Simon boasted that my family had plenty of money and wasn't afraid even if he beat the other person to death. You know that the other person's father is the director of the Education Bureau. If this matter isn't handled properly, everyone will be in big trouble. Well, you should suspend classes and deal with it first. After hearing this, I almost couldn't stand still and fell to the ground. All the hard work in studying and the honors I had won during this period were all ruined by Simon. I opened my mobile phone and saw that the campus network was full of ridicule towards me. Even the information of my parents had been dug out. After all, I was the number one on the school beauty list. When I pushed open the door of my home, I saw Simon and his mother at a glance. He hung his head, looking like he had done something wrong, and kept assuring my parents that he would never make such a mistake again in the future. My father had already felt guilty towards him. Now that he finally saw that Simon was willing to repent, there was even a hint of excitement in his tone. It's okay as long as you know you're wrong. Uncle will try every means to help you deal with this matter. My mother was extremely embarrassed. I met Mrs. Jean, the wife of Director Jean, at a dinner last time. I don't know if she'll give us face or not. I snorted coldly. Simon doesn't need your help at all. Maybe he'll say you're meddling in other people's business after you help him this time. My father scolded angrily, "Why are you so ignorant? If it weren't for you, would Simon have hit someone?" I turned around and looked at Simon. He gave me a provocative smile. I knew what had happened. Jean Xing just mocked Carol for dropping to the second place on the list, and Simon directly threw a punch at him. He even ignored the people around trying to stop him, picked up a stool and smashed it at Jean Xing's head. When he beat the other person until his head was bleeding, he said in a hooligan-like manner, "Dare to touch my woman, I'll make you pay for it." I was so blind in the previous life that I thought Simon was mature and steady. My mother tried to persuade Mrs. Jean for a long time, but she just wouldn't relent. She demanded that we must make a public apology and also pay 5 million yuan as compensation for mental damages, or else she would take legal action. While I was sitting aside, bored, playing with my fingernails, Simon said, "Uncle and Aunt, why don't you let Eleanor apologize for me?" I immediately got angry. Afraid to take responsibility for what you've done. Are you even a man? You caused the trouble yourself. Not only do you ask my family to solve it for you, but now you're pushing me out to take the blame. Why don't you go yourself? My mother tugged at me from behind. Simon's mother immediately started crying. It's all because my child's father died early. Our Simon had the best grades in his class when he was in primary school. My father's face turned dark red after hearing this. He shouted at me in an unfriendly tone, "Eleanor, it won't cost you anything to apologize. Simon is a man and will get married in the future. How can he do such a shameful thing?" I stared at this extremely strange man. Since Simon's father saved my father in the fire, he had started to put Simon first in everything. When we were kids and Simon and I were playing around and both of us fell down at the same time, he would always ask Simon first if he was hurt anywhere. Did he forget that I was his biological daughter and that I also needed care? I forced back my tears and didn't let them fall. After a while, I said, "No problem. I'll apologize for him. However, I have a requirement." After a while, I said, "No problem. I'll apologize for him. However, I have a requirement." While everyone was holding their breath, I raised my hand and slapped him in the face. "Dad, Mom, after this matter, I'll cut off all ties with Simon. Please don't involve me in anything that happens to him in the future." Simon came to his senses and raised his hand to hit me. I looked at him with contempt. Sure enough, Simon wasn't much of a man. I pointed at my face and said, "Come on. After hitting me, let's see who will apologize for you." He angrily put down his hand after hearing this and kicked over the trash can beside him. I ignored him and turned around to go upstairs. On the day when I went to the hospital to visit Jean Sheng, Mrs. Jean gave me a hard time in every possible way, but I endured it all. The video of my apology also quickly spread on the campus network. When I got home, my parents prepared a table of dishes to reward me. I wasn't in the mood to eat and planned to go straight back to my room. But when I walked to the door of the study, I heard Simon say, "I told you it would be okay. Eleanor is always pestering me. Now how could she miss the chance to show off in front of me?" I wanted to push the door open, but when I thought that I had said that I wouldn't have anything to do with Simon anymore, I just deliberately shouted towards the study, "Mom, why is there a dog in our study?" My mother didn't hear clearly and replied, "There's no dog. There's only Simon in the study." Simon opened the door and was about to say something. I gave him a disdainful look and went straight upstairs. Simon could be shameless. But if he was so shameless towards me, he should be able to bear the consequences. Just as I expected, everyone was talking about why it was Simon who had hit someone so hard, yet I was the one who ended up apologizing in the end. Director Jean personally called my father and demanded that Simon must apologize himself. Because of this incident, I was suspended from school for a week and missed a lot of knowledge. I kept complaining to my father that if I didn't go back to school soon, I would be at the bottom of the class. He had no choice but to make Simon apologize. When my best friend called me, I was looking at the video of a tall guy who was 1.8 meters tall, looking so coy and embarrassing. I couldn't help laughing out loud. "Eleanor, you're so smart. You managed to force Simon to show up himself." I just gave it a little push. Actually, it wasn't that I was so capable, but that Simon was too childish. Since he wanted to hide behind others, I just had to push him to the front. My mother, a woman who had been pampered since childhood, was scolded by Mrs. Jean for 3 hours straight. My father was demoted in the company. However, Simon just stayed at home all day playing games, shouting that if he wasn't transferred to another school, he wouldn't go to school at all. It would be okay if the school he wanted to transfer to was an elite high school, but it happened to be the worst school in the whole city. His mother wept every day, begging my parents to help discipline him. "My son has mental problems. He insists that he has learned all this knowledge once before and that he can get into a good university even without studying." I couldn't help laughing when I heard this. Didn't Simon know the truth that learning is like rowing upstream, not to advance is to drop back? In his current state, it would be good enough if he could still have a school to go to. My father asked me the real reason why Simon wanted to transfer schools. I replied vaguely, probably because he feels ashamed. But I knew the real reason was that Carol had transferred to that school. When Simon came to my home to pick up his mother, I was doing my homework. He whistled at me and said mockingly, "Some people just know how to study blindly. In the end, they still won't do as well in exams as I do." My hand that was writing paused for a moment. It was true in the previous life, but in this life, everything was still unknown. I ignored him and continued to lower my head to do the test paper. About a minute later, the sound of a vase being smashed came from outside. What's wrong with me just wanting to be in the same school as Carol? You all wish that I could be with Eleanor. I'll make it clear today. I wouldn't even touch her even if she was offered to me for free. I threw my pen on the table, opened the door and walked up to my parents. "Dad, please let Simon transfer schools. Otherwise, he'll hate me for the rest of his life." I had a deep understanding of Simon's narrow-mindedness. My father was so angry that he took a few steps back. Fortunately, my mother supported him. "Forget it. As long as your mother agrees, I can't control you either." His mother cried for a long time and finally compromised. However, she put forward a requirement for him, which was that he must study hard no matter what and couldn't be a good-for-nothing hooligan anymore. Simon readily agreed. In the previous life, whenever his mother couldn't control him, she would come to me. She said, "Our Simon only listens to you. He'll definitely listen to what you say." But he didn't listen to what I said either. All he listened to were my family's money and my father's power. When I went to the kitchen to get the trash can, Simon followed me. He leaned against the wall and said mockingly, "I knew it was you who told on me about Carol and me." I ignored him and continued with what I was doing. He didn't care and continued, "If it weren't for you in the previous life, Ran and I would have been married long ago. In this life, I won't marry anyone except her." I stopped and smiled at him. "Then I wish you a happy wedding in advance and hope you'll have a baby soon." Then I put on a cold expression again and walked out without looking sideways. A stupid person who voluntarily gives up a bright future and only knows about romantic affairs at the age when he should be studying hard. What's there to envy? All I had to do was to study hard so that Simon would be out of my league in the future. During the days when I didn't have to deal with Simon, I buried myself in hard study every day. After the college entrance examination results came out, I got admitted to the university I had been longing for as I wished. I heard from my father that Simon didn't even get 200 points in the exam. Simon didn't expect that he would do so poorly in the exam. At first, he couldn't accept it and even threatened to commit suicide. Every day, he either hid in his room drinking and smoking or just slept all day long. Simon's mother cried at home every day. He couldn't stand it anymore and finally opened the door of his room. In college, I kept improving myself. I not only became a member of the school student union but also had many suitors. However, I wasn't satisfied. I was preparing to go abroad for postgraduate studies. At school, my parents often called me to tell me about Simon's affairs. He was becoming more and more indulgent. What kind of person is that Carol? She dresses up gaudily every day and hangs out with a bunch of hooligans. Is Simon brilliant? He still stays with her all day long. After they went to college, they even lived together. Simon's mother went there to make a scene several times. Simon insisted that since he couldn't fulfill his wish in the previous life, he must marry her in this life. Simon even hit his mother for her sake. His mother was so angry that she had to stay in the hospital for several days, but Simon didn't even go to visit her once. He was so angry that he even asked me if I took such good care of his mother because I had an affair with her. I told my father that Simon was already an adult and had his own judgment ability. Instead of trying to control him all the time, it would be better to let go. Maybe one day he'll suddenly come to his senses. My father was silent. Only his heavy breathing could be heard from the phone. I knew that he was extremely disappointed in Simon. In the past, he had even thought about giving Simon half of the shares in the company. But now, how could he entrust such an unbearable person with important responsibilities? In the previous life, with the help of my family, Simon had a smooth life almost all the time. The only unpleasant thing was that he was forced to transfer to an elite school and later married me. In this life, he still thought that everything would go as he wished just like before. He was wrong. From the moment he only knew how to do whatever he wanted, he couldn't turn back. However, now that I had a second chance at life, I didn't want to live a life where I had to beg others to like me and watch others' faces. I was so excellent. Why did I have to like Simon? Compared with winning his heart, I was more eager to firmly seize the opportunity to study abroad. All things come to those who wait. When I got the admission notice from the overseas university I liked, I excitedly called my family. My father told me a piece of news that surprised me a lot. Carol is pregnant. I immediately felt it was rather ridiculous. Simon isn't a responsible good man either. Wasn't it only a matter of time before Carol got pregnant? Although it's quite common for people to get pregnant before marriage, and the worst case scenario is just to get married and have the baby, this kind of thing is still a bit tricky for two college students. I wonder how Simon and his mother, who had high hopes for him, would handle it. I kept my tone calm and tried my best to hide my excitement. Then congratulations to Simon. There will be an heir. My father was silent for a long while and then said in a low voice, "Come back and have a look." Your Simon's mother was so angry that she was hospitalized. Even though I didn't quite like Simon's mother, she was an elder after all. Since my father had asked me to come back, I had no choice but to buy a plane ticket and go home that night. The first thing I did after arriving home was to visit Simon's mother in the hospital. She was just being discharged when I was on my way back. As soon as I pushed open the door of the ward, her tears started falling down. She cried and shouted, "If my son were half as sensible and motivated as you, how could I worry about there being no heir in the Simon family?" Simon's father was such a noble and virtuous man. If he knew that I had raised his son like this, he would scold me even in the underworld. The light and shadows intertwined and overlapped. I was in a trance and seemed to go back to the day when I married Simon. There were many guests in the magnificent wedding hall, and Simon's mother couldn't stop smiling. She held my hand and said, "It's really a blessing that our Simon married you, which must be the result of good deeds in his previous life." I pursed my lips and smiled without saying a word, just looking at Simon affectionately. He, however, had an expressionless face with a bit of impatience in his eyes. My heart was faintly stabbed with pain. I secretly vowed that I must be the best wife in the world. I would let Simon know by my actions that he hadn't made a mistake in marrying me. Soon after marriage, we had a child, and my work ability was recognized by my superiors, so I was promoted to be the director. However, Simon's mother always disliked that I was busy with work every day and had no time to take care of the family. She almost called me every day to persuade me to resign. Later, I really resigned and became a housewife. She then disliked that I had no source of income and couldn't share the pressure for Simon. She also said that if there wasn't enough money, she would use my dowry. Even when I was paralyzed all over and urgently needed her care, she refused, saying that she wasn't in good health and it was really inconvenient for her to come over. I suppressed the hatred in my heart and peeled an apple for Simon's mother and put it beside her bed. As a result, Simon walked over, raised his hand and threw the apple hard into the trash can. Before I could react, he started scolding me harshly. "How dare you come here? If it weren't for you, how could they not accept Ran? Damn it! How could I have married such a person in my previous life?" I raised the bag in my hand and threw it straight at Simon's face. He let out a cry of pain. "You got her pregnant before getting married. Are you even a man? When I apologized for you, I said that I would cut off all ties with you, and you agreed at that time. Don't blame me for every bad thing that happens to you." Simon's mother kept pounding on the bed with her hand. "If Carol were a good girl, I would agree. But look at her. Even though she's pregnant now, she still goes out to race motorcycles on other men's motorcycles every day. How can such a woman be the daughter-in-law of the Simon family?" Simon wiped the blood on his forehead with his hand, pushed all the fruits on the table to the ground angrily and roared, "She reported to me in advance before going out to play. She also promised me that there would be no accidents. She's still young. What's wrong with her loving to play? I just like her liveliness and cuteness. Does marrying a wife have to be as boring as Eleanor? If so, I'd rather be single for the rest of my life." Simon's mother struggled to sit up and asked painfully, "You can get married while still in school. Why do you have to drop out? Getting married in school is too troublesome. I have to come back to take care of Ran." I folded my arms and quietly watched him lying. "What taking care of Carol? I think he clearly just thinks that going to school is boring and it doesn't matter whether he goes to school or not. Sure enough," he continued, "I'm good at medicine. I can also open a clinic to support myself." I spat out the water I had just drunk. Did he still think it was the previous life? I rarely opened my mouth to remind him, "Without a doctor's qualification certificate, where can you open a clinic?" He raised his eyebrows. "I can't do it, but there's your father. Even if I can't open a clinic, your father should be responsible for my life, right? If it weren't for my father, would he have achieved what he has now? There's no way he can turn his back on us now." I was once again impressed by his amazing way of thinking. Instead of striving for progress himself, he just wanted to rely on others. Such a person is even worse than a parasite. At least a parasite has to attach itself to something else out of necessity, but Simon clearly has his own hands and feet but still only wants to depend on others. "Does it feel so good to live off your parents?" I asked him back. He pursed his lips, and his eyes became much darker. "Your father owes it to my family." My father, who had just pushed the door open and still had his hand on the doorknob, froze at the door. His eyes were full of pain. Only he could tell what it felt like to raise a child for many years, but that child never forgave him. He smiled bitterly, walked to Simon's mother's bedside and said with concern, "The child has grown up. In the past, we only cared about whether he could fly high. It's time to care about whether he lives well." Simon excitedly stood up and asked, "So you agree?" My father looked at him and just sighed and remained silent. He said impatiently, "What on earth do you mean? Can you just say something understandable?" Simon in this life is no longer as polite and gentle as he was in the previous life. The dissatisfaction and resentment from 2 lifetimes have blinded him with hatred, and he has never been able to forgive my father. He always thinks that if it weren't for my father, his father wouldn't have died in that fire. So he couldn't even wait for me to die on my own and deliberately set a fire to make me die without a burial place. Simon's mother coughed a few times. I'm not dead yet. Even if your father, Eleanor, agrees, I will never let you marry that seductive woman into our family. She's not a seductive woman. She's the mother of my child. I'll say it again. I won't marry anyone except Ran. After saying that, Simon slammed the door and left, leaving Simon's mother crying sadly. That night, Simon's mother was so angry that she was hospitalized again. When the doctor issued a critical illness notice and was looking for the immediate family members, I kept calling Simon, but no one answered. The last time I called, Simon finally answered. A sweet female voice came from the other side. Eleanor, are you done? If you keep pestering my husband, I'll. Please tell Simon that his mother is dying. After saying that, I hung up the phone. Unfortunately, Simon was still a step too late. When he burst into the ward, my whole family was crying uncontrollably. Simon couldn't believe what was in front of him. He suddenly dropped to his knees beside the bed, broke down and shouted, "How could this happen? All I wanted was to get married." He rushed over like a madman and grabbed my arm. "Eleanor, was it you? Did you do something to my mother?" I shook off his arm and without hesitation slapped him hard across the face. "Simon, you've really disappointed me. Even now, you're still blaming me for this." He painfully fell to the ground, crying and pounding the floor with his fists. Looking at this pitiful man in front of me, a trace of sympathy briefly flashed through my heart. But that feeling disappeared in an instant. Simon didn't know that in the previous life, his mother had a serious brain disease and it was only because of my meticulous care that she got much better. I had once asked to tell Simon about this, but Simon's mother always said that Simon had finally got through the hard times and it was better not to let him know for now. Perhaps the reincarnation of Simon and me disrupted the timeline, causing Simon's mother, who could have lived for a few more years, to reach the end of her life ahead of time. In the previous life, when he caused my mother's death, did he ever think about how sad I was? Well, now he knows. Simon's mother's funeral was kept simple. After going through all the procedures, our family and Simon sat down together frankly. In just a few days, he seemed to have aged more than 10 years. His eye sockets were sunken, he had a scruffy beard, and he sat there motionless with a dull look in his eyes. Before this small meeting was held, no one knew that Simon would bring Carol along. My father, with a gloomy face, spoke first. "How dare you bring her here?" Simon, listlessly puffing on a cigarette, said, "She's carrying the offspring of the Simon family, so she's part of the Simon family." Carol lowered her head and touched her belly, looking very disdainful. "Who do you people think you are? Who knows if you were the ones who secretly made my mother-in-law sick?" My father slapped the table and was so angry that he was about to reach out to hit her. Seeing this, I quickly stopped him. Carol actually laughed. She pointed at her own face. "If you've got the guts, hit me. Let's see if Simon will do anything." I patted my father's back soothingly and then called the family nanny. "Mother of Eleanor, that's it for today. If you dare to let this dog in again next time, you'll probably lose your job." The mother of Eleanor replied with a smile, but Carol's face turned extremely ugly. She gritted her teeth and asked, "What do you mean?" I squinted at her and smiled without answering. Simon pulled Carol's arm, and then the two of them dropped the matter. My father said, "Simon, are you determined to marry this woman even if it means your mother will die with her eyes wide open?" Simon impatiently lit another cigarette and replied in the face of Carol's eager gaze, "Yes." After that, the room fell into dead silence. My father took out a bank card from his pocket and put it on the table. When Carol saw it, her eyes lit up. She immediately picked up the bank card and asked, "How much money is in it? Is it enough for Simon and me to live on?" My father didn't bother to pay attention to her and said to Simon, "There are 30 million yuan in the card. Consider it as my one-time payment to clear all the debts owed to your family. From now on, don't ever say that the Eleanor family owes you anything again." As soon as these words were spoken, I immediately understood my father's intention. It seemed that he was so heartbroken by Simon that he planned to cut off all ties with him. Carol was so excited that she almost jumped up. She held the card tightly and didn't want to let it go at all. And Simon's gaze seemed to fall on me casually. He seemed to be wondering why I never tried to stop this. I met his gaze and held my head high, saying, "Congratulations. You've finally got rid of my family's control and regained complete freedom." He nodded, stood up, and was about to leave, pulling Carol along. When he reached the door, he stopped in his tracks and turned around, saying in an intriguing tone, "Uncle, Eleanor's father, I wish you all the best." I was startled and realized that his revenge plan was about to begin. In the previous life, Simon gradually launched his revenge plan after I was paralyzed in bed. He anonymously reported that my father had embezzled public funds, causing my father to be wrongly accused and driven out of the company he had founded himself. In this life, I would never let Simon's plan succeed no matter what. After getting the money, Simon quickly dropped out of school and bought a large luxury apartment in the best area in the city center. I learned about his marriage from moments on WeChat. My father and mother didn't hear a single word about it. Whenever the family talked about Simon, there would be silence. During the days when I was studying hard, I not only kept an eye on Simon's movements but also often reminded my father to be on guard against Simon and Ken from the finance department. Unfortunately, even though we had been extremely careful, something still went wrong. As soon as I walked out of the examination room, I received a call from my father. He said anxiously, "Eleanor, come back quickly. I'm being thoroughly investigated by the board of directors, and your mother was so scared that she's been hospitalized." After hanging up the phone, I quickly bought a plane ticket. On the plane, I kept thinking about everything in the previous life. At that time, Simon took my mobile phone away, so I couldn't communicate with the outside world at all. I also got the news about my father from Simon's few words. That day, he held a fruit knife in his hand and gently scratched a blood stain on my face. I glared at him with bloodshot eyes and spat at him. He wasn't angry. He casually wiped his face and said, "I asked Ken from the finance department to cook the books. Even the most senior accountants won't be able to find out what's wrong. Then I'll find someone to identify that your father embezzled public funds." Ken. I had met this person before. He was a brother who started the company with my father, but those few people had all become senior executives in the company without exception. Because my father trusted Ken so much and thought it was the safest to put him in charge of the finance department. Although my father didn't give Ken a promotion, he had never treated him unfairly. Now it seemed that Ken had always held a grudge about this. After getting off the plane, I was about to take a taxi. Unexpectedly, Simon's car stopped in front of me. I wanted to pretend that I didn't see it, but he rolled down the window and said straightforwardly, "Let's talk about your father's matter." I snorted coldly, "I have nothing to talk to you about." He got out of the car, casually leaning his arm on the car door. "If you want your mother to live well, then come with me." A chill instantly ran down my back. "What have you done to my mother?" He didn't answer, with a strange smile on his lips. Helplessly, I had no choice but to sit in the passenger seat. The car sped all the way to near my father's company. While I was unbuckling my seat belt, he suddenly took out a knife and put it against my neck. This time, I wasn't afraid at all. I leaned my neck forward a little and said, "Go ahead. If you've got the guts, kill me like you did in the previous life. Let your unborn child become a single-parent family just like you. Do you, Daddy?" He withdrew the knife and said viciously through gritted teeth, almost losing his sanity, "When your father killed mine, why didn't he think that he had an underage child? I've told you so many times that my father didn't kill yours on purpose. I would never allow him to slander my father wantonly again." After about 4 or 5 minutes or so, a big and burly man opened the car door. Simon said to him respectfully, "Ken, I brought Eleanor for you." Ken nodded and sat in the back seat. Simon then started the car. After he was fully focused on driving, Ken and I exchanged a glance. Simon never expected that Ken and I were in cahoots. By the time he realized it, it was already too late. The veins on his forehead bulged as he spun the steering wheel out of control. "If you don't want me to live, then let's all die together." There was a bridge right ahead, and it was obvious that he wanted to drive into the river. I screamed and struggled to snatch the control of the steering wheel from Simon's hands. Ken, clearly an experienced man in the business world, didn't show a trace of panic. He calmly made 2 phone calls and then began to rest with his eyes closed. I was so panicked that my hands were almost cramped. Seeing his calm appearance, I was on the verge of scolding him. However, when I looked up, there were already 4 cars neatly blocking the front of the car we were in. In the next second, my consciousness became chaotic under the violent impact. When I opened my eyes again, both my father and mother were by my bedside. They anxiously asked me if I felt uncomfortable anywhere. As I looked at them, my eyes became moist. "I thought I would never see you again." My father also wiped away his tears. "I didn't expect Simon to be so cruel. I should have known better than to let you take risks." My father didn't know how ruthless Simon was, but I did. If I hadn't taken risks, it was very likely that my whole family would have lost their lives in the future. Simon didn't know that all of this was a trap, a net we had woven for him with our own hands. From the many secret conversations between my father and Ken to reach a cooperation, to my father deliberately showing weakness and being investigated, and then to my nervously coming back to the country and getting into his car, all of this was just to make him let down his guard. To expose his secrets in the car and then for me to record them to get the key evidence. This time, my father didn't intend to forgive Simon easily. He came to kneel in front of our house and cried for a long time, but my father avoided seeing him. When I went out, he grabbed my ankle as if grasping a life-saving straw. "Simon is such an irresponsible child. He kept provoking your father. He said something like why the one who survived wasn't his father, and then he smashed everything in." He shouted with a hoarse voice, "Your Eleanor family owes my family a life, and you'll never be able to repay it in this lifetime." I sneered coldly. "Those who only complain will never get any good results." After saying that, I ignored him and drove out of the door. When I got home in the evening, the yard was in a mess. My mother sighed. "Simon is such an irresponsible child. He kept provoking your father. He said something like why the one who survived wasn't his father, and then he smashed everything in the yard." That night, my father sat in the study all night. The next day, he announced that he would let Simon go. I was the first one who didn't agree with this. When we gave him that 30 million yuan, we had already cut off all ties. Why was he doing this now? Was it because his father had saved my father's life back then that we deserved to be bled by him for the rest of our lives? But my father had made up his mind and wouldn't listen to any of my persuasion. I was so angry in my heart. While thinking about how to teach Simon a lesson, I happened to see Carol flirting with a man in the shopping mall. Looking at the happy appearance of the two of them, I clearly realized that my opportunity had come. To confirm my doubts in my mind, I observed Carol for many days in a row. After getting the answer, I wrote an anonymous letter to Simon. I learned from a friend that Carol had given birth to a lovely daughter for Simon and had forced him to invest under her coercion. Unfortunately, Simon lost all his money in the investment and ended up working as a deliveryman. Looking at the pictures of Simon delivering food that he posted on Moments, I felt a sense of pleasure in my heart. How glorious he was back then. Everywhere he went, there were always 7 or 8 students following him. His medical skills were quite famous in the industry. Often, celebrities and wealthy merchants would invite him to dinner, hoping that he could be the chief surgeon for their family members. And now, he was making a big fuss in the hospital corridor. He grabbed Carol's hair and kept punching and kicking her. "You slut! I even angered my mother to death because of you. Not only did you cheat on me during our marriage, but you also gave birth to a bastard." "My daughter is not a bastard. It's you who's useless. You couldn't get me pregnant even after so many times," Carol retorted fearlessly. I stood not far away, listening to this pleasant quarrel. Simon couldn't have been unaware that he had health problems and that the chance of getting a woman pregnant was extremely slim. In the previous life, for the sake of his face, he insisted that it was my problem. Not only did Simon's mother blame me, but my family also forced me to drink a lot of medicine. It made my health extremely poor. Sometimes I felt like falling down even when walking on the road. It was only when I was doing a thorough cleaning that I found out that he was secretly taking medicine himself. At that time, I was so excited that I burst into tears. I thought that all the suffering I had endured was worth it. Now, bah! It was so stupid to get pregnant for such a man. I couldn't help but applaud Carol in my heart. Since he refused to admit that it was his problem, then just have a child with another man. Simon's face immediately darkened, and he didn't dare to say a word in rebuttal. Seeing this, Carol became even more arrogant. Do you know what I did with the money you invested? Ha ha ha, it all went into the hands of my daughter's father. You're just a fool, being played around by me. Simon couldn't bear it anymore. He jumped up and kicked Carol, sending her flying quite a distance. People around, seeing this situation, were either too scared or came up to stop the fight. But as soon as they saw Simon's fierce and ferocious look, they were too frightened to step forward. Finally, it was the security guards who came up and persuaded them to leave. After leaving the hospital, Carol asked for a divorce, but Simon firmly refused. He felt that he had already lost everything for Carol. If he lost his wife too, then his life would be in vain. Since Carol's affair had already been exposed, she didn't hide it anymore. That man went to Simon's house to make trouble almost every day. Simon is just a gigolo and can't even fight. He gets so angry every day that he starts drinking to drown his sorrows. One day, when he got home, he found that all his things had been thrown out, and Carol came out of the room with that man, both of them with their clothes in disarray. This became the last straw that completely enraged Simon. He secretly installed a surveillance camera at home. After pretending to go out, he sat in his car and watched the scene inside the house. As soon as he saw the man enter the house, he rushed into the house with a big, thick stick. After a scuffle, the man died on the spot with his head broken and bleeding, and Carol was so frightened that she became mentally unstable. Fortunately, the poor child was sent back to Carol's parents' home and was luckily unharmed. I learned about this when the police station called my father and said that Simon's first request after being imprisoned was to see me and my father. My father asked me if I wanted to go. I didn't refuse. Simon, bathed in the sunlight, looked extremely wretched. Now, in my eyes, he is no different from a clown. After a long silence, he said with a pained expression, "Is it too late for me to say that I was wrong now?" I gave a faint smile. There's no turning back in life. Every step you take is your own choice. Only now do I understand that getting to this point is entirely his own doing. And in my previous life, ending up being brutally killed was also the result of my own actions. I loved someone who didn't love me back. Forcing things won't lead to any good outcome. He gave a bitter smile. 30 million yuan went down the drain, and the daughter isn't even mine. Eleanor, you were really good to me. It was only after I was out of the picture that I realized my love for you. I let you down in my last life. If there's a next life, would you be willing to give me another chance? Looking at his pleading look, I almost threw up. I must be crazy to have married a man who once killed me with his own hands. Simon, stop talking nonsense. I'm going to study abroad next, and I'm afraid I'll never come to see you again. I wish you a good journey to the underworld in advance. Walking out of the prison, I suddenly remembered something, so I took a taxi to the cemetery. I told Simon's mother everything about Simon and also informed her of the news that Simon was about to be executed. After that, I looked up at the sky with a carefree mood and found that the sun was really bright today. The end.